Hey there, what's going on everybody? This video was originally only going to be on my Patreon, just like the rest of the videos in this series about activism during the first Trump presidency, but I decided to put it on the main channel to give you a sneak peek of what's coming down the road. I think you're really going to enjoy this video and this series, and if you do, definitely check out my Patreon. It's only $5 a month for a bunch of different exclusive content, including access to this series. Regardless, I really hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for watching. Antifa, or anti-fascist action. What is it and why am I starting the series with it? Well, I'm starting with it because if there was no Antifa, there would have been no right-wing response to anything that was going on a street level from the far left in this country. We got Trump in 2016, we took it as the victory we thought it was at the time, and we were ready to just sit back and let him do whatever he was going to do, good, bad, or ugly. But because there were groups like Antifa that formed and started harassing and hurting people physically and otherwise, people started to take notice and they started to want to resist that. And that's where certain groups came to be, like Patriot Prayer in the Pacific Northwest. You had the Proud Boys, who started as a joke from Gavin McInnes, but they became a little bit more serious as time went on as a result of what was going on. And then that's where people like me came in, where someone like me, I don't like when innocent people get bullied, especially not by domestic terrorists. So because I saw that was going on, I wanted to try and do my part to protect innocent people who were not breaking any laws either and had never harmed anybody. So when I talk about Antifa, I'm only going to be talking about the American version. I'm not going to be talking about the modern iteration of it in Europe, and I'm not going to be talking about the original version of it in 1930s Germany. They have nothing in common with each other other than the fact that they jacked the flag from the original Antifa from 1930s Germany. We are going to have to visit Europe briefly, though, when we talk about American Antifa, more specifically England, and something that happened in the 1960s with the genesis of the skinhead subculture. Now, when it comes to skinheads, a lot of people get a lot of things wrong about them. They were not originally any form of politically charged or anything like that, especially not right-wing, but eventually what happened after the subculture formed based around working class identity and mutual interests and hobbies and things like that, politics started to seep in, and that includes both racialist politics as well as communism, anarchism, and all sorts of other different political beliefs. So you had a bunch of different sort of factions, a bunch of different poles in the skinhead subculture, and that included people who didn't care one way or another. They didn't want to be political in any way, shape, or form. But what took over the public conscience when it came to skinheads a lot of the time was that racialist sort of skinhead, you know, the neo-Nazi skinhead archetype and things like that. And what happened when politics set in, though, was there was naturally conflict, and that erupted into fights. And as skinheads spread throughout the world, including to America, a lot of those rifts also came with it or formed naturally as time went on. And that includes in America, where you had a bunch of different groups, both left-wing and right-wing. You had groups that were racialist, anti-racist, all of that stuff. And one of those groups that formed that was anti-racist was the Minneapolis Baldies up in Minnesota. These people were fighting racialist skinheads, and eventually they decided they were going to form a new group, if you want to call it that, or fly a new flag. And that flag was called Anti-Racist Action. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, why would this group of people who already had their own brand, who had their own flag that they were flying, decide to start flying another flag in addition to their original flag? Well, that's because, as I said, skinheads were a subculture. You kind of had to be into the skinhead lifestyle in order to be a part of a skinhead crew. That's just the way that it worked. If you were not a part of the skinhead lifestyle, you probably did not find being a Minneapolis Baldy to be very appealing. So what they did was they decided to form another group that, while headed and influenced by skinheads, it was not explicitly a skinhead group. Just in case there was some guy who was a law student who was about to graduate and he wanted to lend a hand in whatever way that a law student could hand to a group of people who are known to commit crimes and stuff like that, or anything else like that. It was to pull in the normies, essentially, is what it was. And it worked pretty well for what they were trying to do. ARA would form in a bunch of different places. It was mainly a Midwest thing, to my understanding, but you did have certain chapters of it, certain factions that existed outside of the Midwest. And eventually, after years and years of fighting racialist skinheads, of fighting the KKK, of fighting a bunch of different other racial groups, racist groups, whatever you want to call them, the movement started to die down. And the reason for this is because the skinhead subculture started to die down. And when the main group of people that you would fight begins to dissipate, well, that means you're going to be getting into a lot less fights, regardless of what kind of fight it is. You are now a soldier without an enemy. You're a rebel without a cause. You're an army without a foreign nation to invade. Because of this, their own movement started to peter. And when you have a group of people who are sort of like a professional activist class, or even if they're not like a pro-activist class, a large part of their identity stems from or revolves around that kind of activity, they're going to start to look for new causes to try and pick up and get into fights about. And that is essentially what happened with anti-fascist action. You had different anti-racist action chapters, along with some groups that weren't necessarily ARA or flying that banner. They formed what was known as the Torch Antifa Network. That is the first instance of a real anti-fascist action brand in America. I wanted to stick this segment in to highlight the fact that there were groups that were using the name Antifa before Torch Antifa Network came about. Rose City Antifa was actually the first example of it in the US, but when it comes to that, they were a local group. It's kind of like FSU in Boston. You weren't going to go out to Boise, Idaho and find FSU groups. That was kind of a Boston and Eastern United States thing. When it comes to the first example of national level Antifa, anti-fascist action, that would be Torch Antifa Network. So I wanted to highlight that. And either way, regardless of who it was, they were still a group and they are still groups. Rose City Antifa still exists. Torch Antifa Network still exists. And they started as groups of people under a specific brand that were organized in that way, not just a flag or an idea or anything like that. It formed in the Midwest. Like I said, there was a group from Chicago that was one of the members. I forget some of the other people. I'm doing all this off the top of my head. But the bottom line is ARA essentially rebranded into AFA, Anti-Fascist Action. That is where Antifa comes from in America. Now, I'm not saying that every group in particular stems from that original Torch Antifa network. However, Torch Antifa network was the first group to adopt that aesthetic and start calling themselves that and start operating in the way that modern Antifa operates in. And that is where we get a lot of different groups nowadays. New York is a hive for Antifa action. Philadelphia, another hive. Montreal, up in Canada, that's another hive of them. And of course, who can forget the Pacific Northwest? Pretty much every major city and suburb is an Antifa stronghold. It's important to highlight the fact that Antifa started out as a group, because a lot of people on the far left will lie to you and they'll say, whoa, well, actually Antifa is a brand, it's an idea, it's a movement, it's not a group. But they're lying. They're not 100% lying, but they are lying and they are aware of what they're doing there. Antifa started out as a group, and there are branded Antifa cells all across the nation that explicitly and specifically utilize the Antifa brand to describe and brand their group. So yes, Antifa can be a group, but the reason why they'll say that and the reason why they're not lying 100% is because what happens a lot of the time when Antifa does anything is they'll have somebody from, say, Extinction Rebellion who their main goal, their main purpose in life is to try and fight climate change. But when some group comes to town that they disagree with and Antifa is going to counter that group, they'll shack up with Antifa on the day, or even longer than that, depending. They'll have really, really friendly dealings with an Antifa cell because they know that it's a good way for them to be able to move around as safely as possible while doing illegal activities on the day of a protest. So they're not 100% wrong. They're not 100% lying, but they're lying enough as to where it's immoral and disingenuous. The big reason why they tell these lies is because they're trying to obscure anything that could get them into some kind of trouble. And this is exactly why they organize and operate the way that they do. I have here with my very fancy graphics, as you can see, an example of what a vertical hierarchy would look like. Now, I don't think I need to go hardcore into explaining this because everybody is aware of these kinds of things. If you have a job, you're aware of this, but this is the way things tend to work, is there's one guy on top, he delegates tasks to people below him. The people below him may even delegate tasks further. Now, this is part of the reason why the mafia isn't around anymore, is because this was the way that they would organize. And eventually, in either the 70s or 80s, I forget which, you had RICO charges that were involved. And the idea of RICO charges was that now the leaders of these crime families could be charged for things that their underlings did. And because of that, the leader would be taken out, which now means the whole organization crumbles underneath him. This is why the mafia is not as big of a thing anymore as it used to be. It used to be inescapable depending on where you were at, what city you were in, and things like that. You were probably going to have to deal with them at some point if you were shacking up there. But you don't have to deal with that anymore because of RICO charges. Now, Antifa, being aware of this, they decided not to organize vertically, but to organize horizontally, okay? The idea is every person in this line is his own independent actor. Nobody can tell him what to do. Nobody can tell him what to be a part of or anything like that. And what would happen in a situation like that is that you would have people who, they're kind of well respected. They're listened to a little bit more than others, but they're not leaders. They're just people who are respected, and it was probably best for you to do what they asked you to do or suggested that you do. The reason why this protects people is because if there's no leader, then there's no leader to take out, which means the rest of the organization will not crumble. So let's say this guy right here decides he's going to throw a Molotov at a protest. Well, he gets arrested, but everybody else is fine because nobody else threw the Molotov. Nobody else went along with him throwing the Molotov. He didn't tell anybody to do that. That was completely and totally his own thing. It was his idea. Therefore, he went down for it. The rest of the cell is able to move freely through the riot. And honestly, it also helps to protect the guy that threw the Molotov in the first place because you can't arrest people who aren't doing anything illegal. And standing around is not illegal. Wearing the same clothes as somebody who did something illegal is not illegal. So when that guy emerges from a crowd to throw a Molotov and then melts back into that crowd, for one thing, the officers are going to have a hard time even identifying that guy in the first place. But let's say they did. It's going to be really hard for them to do anything because they're going to have to push their way through a crowd that is not going to be acting the way they want that crowd to, and that guy is going to be able to escape. So it all really kind of acts as a circular sort of thing where everything kind of justifies the next thing and the next thing and the next thing all the way until you complete that cycle. That's just the way that Antifa is organized. It's actually pretty interesting and pretty ingenious. So where is Antifa in the modern day? Because I said that it was the first Trump presidency, that 2016 era, that they really came into their own and people started to resist them. Well, they don't really exist in the way that we think of anymore. They do exist, but they tend to stick to the shadows a lot more. You will see people around who do their thing, but they are not as big of a force as they used to be, and there's multiple reasons for that. For one thing, it's a lot more stable under the second Trump presidency. There's been a lot of things that have happened over the years that have made it a little bit infeasible for Antifa to be able to operate the way that they used to. But then, in addition to that, a lot of them were just getting their asses beat every time they went out. And nobody wants to be affiliated with that, whether it's because they don't want to be hurt or because they are like, oh, those guys are losers. They can't even fight. I don't want to be on the uncool side. So because of that, Antifa has definitely waned. You're seeing different causes pop up and things like that Antifa can and will and probably has taken advantage of on some level, but you're not seeing Antifa the way that it used to be. They're not operating so out in the open. They're not getting interviewed by CNN or anything like that like they used to. Something else I forgot to mention is that one of the big reasons why you don't see Antifa as much as you used to is because a lot of the funding dried up, and there could be many different reasons for this. USAID is a great example, USAID, however you say that shit. People talk about George Soros and all this other stuff, but I don't think George Soros himself was the biggest funder of Antifa. I think it came from a lot of different areas, a lot of different people, and a lot of different groups, and those just don't have the money that they used to, so because of that, they can't organize the way they did. So Antifa as a topic is a very broad one, and I could tell you a lot more about them, but I think I've told you everything that I need to tell you about them at this point. If I told you everything, we would have a 10-hour video, and I don't have the time or the energy to make a 10-hour video, so I just wouldn't make it, and you guys wouldn't know this stuff. But one thing I will say is that Antifa is the culmination of decades and probably even a century or more of left-wing agitation, of communist and anarchist agitation. This is years and years and years of theory that they have developed based off of being out in the streets, causing mayhem and doing a bunch of bad things to a bunch of good people, most of the time, good people. And it's something that the right wing did not understand when they first hit the scene in the way that they did in the 2016 era, but people started to understand them as time went on. And you can believe that as the right wing begins to understand them and counter them, they are going to start countering what the right wing is doing. That's just the way that they are. It's what they've become good at. It's about the only thing that they're really that good at, if we're being honest here. But with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for being my patrons. I appreciate you guys. As you know, I'm going to be doing more videos where I kind of set the scene before I start talking about what actually happened with me when I decided to get into dissident politics. So until next time, thank you guys very much again, and I will catch you later. Peace out.